Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about the new movie, Big George Foreman. Literally up until the trailer of this movie, all I knew about George Foreman is that he makes a mean grill. So when I saw that there was so much more to his story, I had to go check this movie out. The synopsis of this film is basically just telling the real life story of George Foreman. I don't really want to say more than that, otherwise it'll give away everything that happens in the movie. So without further ado, let's get into the 6 things that make a movie great. 1. The plot. First and foremost, the story of George Foreman is incredible. And George Foreman himself was very involved in the making of this movie. He worked closely with George Tillman Jr. in the direction of this film, and made sure that all of the details of his life were told truthfully and honestly, the good and the bad. The downside, however, is that this movie's plot and timeline bounces around more than a beach ball at a Nickelback concert. Granted, all of the jumps are forward in time, so you're not having to guess when it is, but time seemed to jump forward in this movie at least 15 times. You weren't really able to assimilate to any part of his life because you were jumping forward every scene. At the end of the day, you're able to see the full scope of George Foreman's life from when he was a kid that came from nothing to becoming the heavyweight champion. So I guess this film accomplishes its goal in that, but having the full picture and enjoying the journey you went on to get there are not the same. There were a lot of decent undertones that this film had to offer too, including one having to do with George Foreman's faith. But again, because of how choppy the movie was, none of the positive subtones of this film really showed through. So for me, I have to give plot a 50-50. 2 is family friendliness. Big George Foreman is rated PG-13, and there's a very mild bit of profanity, some action and suspense in the boxing sequences, but that's pretty much it. There's not a whole lot to be worried about in this film, which I appreciate, despite you seeing some of the poor decisions that George Foreman made in his life, specifically in his marriage. But because nothing crossed the line, for me, family friendliness gets a thumbs up. 3 is acting and script. Chris Davis plays George Foreman, and I thought he did a decent job. Forrest Whitaker plays Doc, his coach, and Whitaker seemed right at home in his role. I also thought that Sullivan Jones did a good job playing Muhammad Ali. I thought the script of this movie was pretty good. Interactions between characters were good when they happened, but they were pretty short overall. And because you're flashing forward so much and seeing George Foreman at so many different parts of his life, it kind of makes the script and acting suffer a little bit. So for me, acting and script get a 50-50. 4 is character development. The most character development you get in this movie comes from George Foreman, but that's not saying much. Like I always say, there's a difference between character development and character progression. You get to see Foreman as he changes through these different periods of his life, but again, because of how choppy the timeline in this movie is, it really just feels like he's playing 4 or 5 different versions of himself instead of him growing and becoming that one person that he becomes by the end of the film. All of the interactions that Foreman has with the supporting cast are so short and choppy that you don't get to see development between them really at all, which is a bummer because there was a lot of potential here. So for me, character development gets a thumbs down. 5 is visuals and CGI. I thought this movie actually did a pretty good job having Chris Jones progress from being a young 18-year-old boy to being a 45-year-old. At least with the body makeup and cosmetics, it looked really real. But one thing I have to mention is that the boxing scenes were a complete miss for me. You arrived at the matches so quickly or just in the middle of the match to the point where all of the suspense and all of the passion and heart that could go into these scenes was completely gone. The boxing scenes in this movie were lifeless. And it was a huge bummer because, again, there was a lot of potential here to have that be a defining force in the movie. I appreciate the time and effort they put into this movie to follow the true story of George Foreman, but it seems like that's all they did and there wasn't any passion in any of these scenes. So for me, visuals and CGI get a 50-50. And 6 is rewatchability. Big George Foreman is 2 hours and 13 minutes long, and due to all of the choppiness, tone shifts, and pacing issues, this movie felt so long. What kept me in the theater watching this movie is that the true story of George Foreman is incredible and they did a good job of showing the truth. But that was pretty much it, because every other area of this movie was neglected except for telling the truth. And I think there's definitely a way to tell the truth in a way that is very interesting, and that just requires good storytelling. But Tillman Jr.'s directing was not enough to make that happen in this movie, and it ended up just feeling very long and uninspired. So for me, rewatchability gets a thumbs down. With all these areas considered, I have to give Big George Foreman a 5 out of 10. This movie went to great lengths to following the true story of George Foreman, and it's a pretty incredible one. But unfortunately, it sacrificed just about everything else that makes the movie great. There was almost no character development. The fight scenes were not exciting and were honestly pretty boring. And the way that this story was told was so choppy and disorienting that it absolutely murdered almost every area this movie could have excelled in. So with that being said, unfortunately I have to say that Big George Foreman is not a movie that you should spend your time or money going to see in theaters. If you are interested in checking it out, you should wait till it comes out on streaming services. Thank you so much for watching. If you've seen Big George Foreman, please let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. As always, I appreciate your love and support, and I'll catch you guys and gals in the next one.